aspects around coordination or governance. This is real time on the internet, customers logging in, doing things. And I kind of want to really just set a basic picture because I want to pull it back. I want to pull it back to what the basics of applications online really are, which at the end of the day is ultimately signing up for an account, logging in, and doing some things. And I think sometimes when it gets to identity as well, it gets complex. And it gets complex for a reason, because it is complex. But at the same time, there's a lot of underpinning simplicities here that we always miss. So in aspects around sign up and registration and authentication, this is the sort of real brief life cycle of what it means to be identity. But I think identity is also, it means different things to different people, and it definitely depends on the context with which you're actually talking about identity. So access management is absolutely one area. It's not about attributes or storage or things about you. It's about your capacity to authenticate to something securely, represent yourself, do some things that are actually of importance, and to ensure that no one else is doing that. So that's the basics in terms of the framing. But if we can interact with our customers relatively easy, then it's no surprise, obviously, that we can interact very easily with our fraudsters. More to the point, fraudsters interact with us in rates and ways with which, you know, we're not keeping up. So the little sort of blobs of blue there in the bottom left is really about the sort of last year of identity breach. There was a really nice article from the ABC recently about identity breach, and they showed over the last 5-6 years all of the identity breaches that happened, and it's absolutely a monumental scale. This is just the last year, and of course some of them are very Aussie focused. So to my mind, if we think about fraud inside identity and applications or digital applications, the idea of identity data at an account opening scenario is really hard to accept. Like, there's no inherent proof. Just having ID or details about a person is not enough to prove that you're you. So we know that we've already got lots of breaches that actually have sort of reduced the efficacy of account opening based upon private, or what is coined private data. We actually have to view the world as though it is breached. Everything about you is breached, and you've got to look at digital applications as though that the identity data provided to you is breached. So on the account opening fraud side of things, we've got aspects around identity data is no longer enough. And on the other side, the account takeover world, which is really around authenticating through an IDP to an application and then doing things. So log on, do transactions, log off. That's pretty much why we go on the web. That's why we access banks. That's why we do things digitally. But if we look at account takeover in terms of authentication and the ways in which authentication are busted, and I look at this from a very broad sense as well. Think of this as a bit more of a meta conversation around these areas. I'm not trying to bash authentication as a problem. There's definitely problems with authentication, and there are solutions. But at the same time, if we look at where passwords are, we're still using them almost completely ubiquitously, everywhere. And the 60% figure I got there, it varies, depends on which you read, you know, what article you're reading. It's 50%, 60%, 70%, they're all breached. So the idea of passwords alone, something that we rely on so heavily, are broken. So we apply OTPs on top of that, sort of your 2FA. And there's a lot of problems there as well. And I'm more or less saying that things around OTPs, TOTPs that we've already heard from, you know, earlier speakers, the aspects around two-factor authentication can also be deemed as readily broken. SMS OTP has been coined as security theatre. Easy to break, you can bust in. If you want to, you can. We just have to assume it's busted. Same with authenticator apps. There are ways with which, through push fatigue and other methods, you can bust them. And hard tokens, TOTPs, are just a thing of the past. So from those points of view, passwords, 2FA around authentication can be hit hard if someone's going to go after you. And I would point out, of course, that passwordless is a really important thing to think of. Phishing resistant, MFA, absolutely, go for it, because we need this to get into the mix. Now, authentication, certainly within a phishing resistant MFA position, is extremely powerful. But the problem is that we're not adopting it, not at scale. And I know this because we've been working on passwordless for many years, and we know, talking to many customers and prospects out there, that passwordless is a little bit soon, maybe. It is a change control problem. But across that, authentication is a line of defense. And it's just one modality amongst lots of other ways of doing this. So getting into an application is one thing. And what you do when you authenticate, you provide some kind of assurance or trust through secrets or through some kind of challenge response if you're talking about AAL3 cryptographic authentication. You provide that to an IDP, the IDP gives you back other secrets. Those other secrets are tokens, access tokens, session tokens. They are then used to access the application. So at the end of the day, we're all talking about transferring some secrets into other secrets that then you can transact on. But in that side of the world, you've still got attacks happening. And even though it may be limited, relatively speaking, it's still a big problem because fraud is growing year on year. Frankly, we're losing. We are actually losing the war at the moment because the fraudsters are doing worse and worse every year. So if we're in this position where bots and scripting, scams are actually rife, the ability to sort of create cloaking and anonymity when you create an account, and this whole campaigns that are built around defeating applications, we know we're in a difficult spot. So what I'm really asking is how do we push that needle? How do we push harder into the sort of next world? And really what I'm saying is that, well, if we can't trust ID data up front, there are ways, of course, and I'm going to talk slightly about this a little bit later. Authentication, we can't trust your classic 2FA. We can trust phishing resistant MFA, which is great, so do move to that. But in terms of transactions, we can't trust active sessions because people can crack them. So if there's this sort of imagineering around zero trust, the question I have is why do we trust to the level that we do? And when I say we, I mean application owners, digital security practitioners. The reason why we trust what we need to trust, like authenticators that we have and devices that have been logging in, is because we don't know when not to trust. We don't know enough about what's going on around us. And I put a very strong caveat there, your mileage may vary. You might actually be doing a lot of good things in this space. But my experience shows that we're not overly doing that. It's not something that we do every day, and it's something that we're building in as an industry. So I think about end user device intelligence, the riskiness and the trustiness of the devices that you're using, the reliance on broken authentication mechanisms, the idea that some people are only just moving to 2FA now. It's pretty crazy to think of in 23. Our ability to look, or inability to look at networks, like where is traffic coming from? Why is it coming from a device versus, say, an emulator in a data center? And scripts and bots, beyond capture, profiling, normality versus an anomaly. These are all tools that we have to actually look at identity in flight. Arguably, you might think, well, this is not identity, this is about cybersecurity that surrounds identity. And my argument would be that cyber and identity have to come together. Because identity, at the end of the day, is a wire with get and post requests on it with some credentials in it. And whether those credentials were achieved through some other form of authentication, that's the way the internet works. There's still gets and posts. So all of this is happening around the get and the post. This is all the stuff that's surrounding everything that's going on in real time. So from that point of view, we need to see this. This is identity in action. So there are tools. There's definitely lots of vendors out there that are in this space. The idea of behavioral biometrics, IP trust, device sort of tooling, fingerprinting. But the reality is that you might be doing some, but I would want to ask, why aren't we doing all of it? Like, why aren't we watching all of the things? And then even if you get lots of little bits and pieces of knowledge, what you have is a big data point problem, lots of data points to look at. What does that actually mean? Is that fraud? Is that not fraud? It's not easy. Very, very difficult to actually understand what the signal and the noise is. So where's that one context? So observability to me really is not about reporting or that sort of bigger picture post fact. This is about what's happening all at the one time. So extracting data from a passport, doing a match of that data with a selfie and aliveness, registering for an account, logging in, doing some things at various times, transacting. All of these things are part of that one experience, which is what is the thread of identity through that whole sort of fabric. And if I now put this through a view of like, let's look at this from a front to top to bottom view. Let's log on, let's create an account, we'll log on, we'll do some things, we'll transact and we'll exit. So I think about things in terms of independence and interdependent. Independent data points don't tell you a lot. Like an authenticator at a point in time will tell you, yes, someone passed this test, but from that point onwards, things start to get a little bit weird because of time, things can happen. Entropy is a word I suppose you could use. So independent data points are one thing, and some of them are powerful. Phishing resistant MFA is, some things aren't. Interdependent checking between scenarios is actually pretty cool because we can start to stitch together concepts, coalescing of data through what does that mean, is it good, is it bad, and that puts us in a position of power, a position of understanding, a position of observing. So if I look at observability from an independent perspective, we start to look at a classic scenario of logging in and doing something. So this particular little flow here is like a classic way to sort of money mule some money through a system, thinking from a banking perspective. So we sign up, you use some identity data, you authenticate for the first time, you register a new account, you pay in some money from a card, you're overpaid on that account, and so you withdraw what you're owed in credit. So if we look at now how an attacker might actually go along this particular flow, they're going to sign up and it looks fine. They're going to use a stolen passport. Well, we don't know yet that it's stolen, so we just see some identity data. That's true. As far as we can see, we authenticate for the first time. Well, we don't really, we just register our device because we've started a new account. We register a new sub-account. We use a stolen credit card. We don't know it's stolen, so we put the money in. We then register a new bank account. We egress the funds out. A classic scenario of money muling. Independently, nothing looked particularly wrong. So that's the key thing about observability. We're looking at independent points, so we're looking at the bigger set. So if I have another look at this from another angle, we can ask some serious questions. Some questions around, well, who's actually accessing this? Is this about identity and authentication alone, or is this identity and authentication and lots of other things? Which to my mind is part of identity, because these are the rails with which identity runs. So we're going through an anonymizing proxy. We've detected that. That's fine, because I use VPNs, and that's totally normal. But we're coming from a device emulator, and we're also doing it from a data center IP. This is not a retail person sitting behind their Mac at home. This is something else. So from a registration point of view, would you look at all of that data together and think that that's valid? So interdependent perspectives now really are around the idea that we see data points that independently don't really mean much, but together means, hell no, I am not allowing this account to sign up. But if we move on through that and we steal a passport, identity data alone, will you add some selfie and some matching? Well, that's a natural sort of coalescing of data, which we can say, well, you need to be present, you need to look like the document's validated, you're validated, the two together make sense. But even if we get through that, well, we're hitting a low trust device, right? So the device itself is new, we've not seen the device before, it's just been created. So we have this sense of low trustiness around the device. Register a new account, pay some money in, we don't necessarily know the data's, the credit card's stolen. We have an account that's now has credit, and we withdraw that. Would we? Because part of the temporal connection between those events, creating a new account, setting up a new device, putting money in, pulling money out, don't mix. But even if we didn't do that, would you do it on a completely new device anyway? So all of these aspects around trust and risk signals are important, but they make sense when they're in context. And that's what I mean by observability. These are the things that you need to know. It's quite large in terms of the things that you should be understanding in real time to know what's actually happening. So again, I know that this is conversations around identity, but this is what identity looks like on the wire. This is what's coming into your app at any given time, either looking like your customer or actually is your customer. And are you actually going to look at your customer and say, well, I'm going to think you're in and if everything's okay, you're going to do more challenges, you're going to make their life hard. We're going to make life hard just for the fraudsters. But the question is, do you know? So part of that do you know question I have, and this is the challenge I think that we need to do. It's a little bit of a busy slide, I know it's a little ugly. But as we move from the left to the right, we're getting better. And part of that getting better is think of two camps. Bad people, good people. The bad people are fundamentally a mix of real alarms, we actually detected a fraudster, and the grey, we don't know. We're not even sure. And what do you do with that? Like in real time, in your app, this is not even a question. There's no philosophy to that. It's bits and bytes. Something's going to happen. On the other side of it, legitimate users are coming in. They're good people, but there's also false alarms. So do we punish them? Do you have scenarios where you make people step up and log on using extra authenticators and other processes to actually prove that they're all right? Meanwhile, they're a loyal customer, they've been doing it forever, but you can't tell. So as we move to the right, we squeeze the false alarms and we squeeze the grey. And that basically means less false alarms, better experiences for your customers, because you know they're trusting. Everything is looking correct. You squeeze the grey because we now have clear evidence that this in fact is a fraudster. More views on fraudster behaviours means that there's less greys. So that's the end game that we need to get to. And in a lot of ways this is quite meta over the top of identity generally. But it's the world with which identity flows. So it's all part of that mix. So I think really what I want to impress is the fact that identity alone, authentication, a database, some authenticators, some are definitely better than others. Please go passwordless. But they're still winning. Fraudsters are still winning. And we aren't, we need to move the dial. I think I've been in identity for 20 years. I've seen some seriously good movements, but I'm also a little disappointed it hasn't moved so great. And I'm really, using the second half of my career now to make, a completely different world. I want to see fraud drop drastically. We have to make some serious inroads on this. So I think observability is part of that story. It's us getting better, it's us knowing, it's stopping them from slipping through the cracks, it's stopping fraudsters from using those things that we don't currently know. So we need to learn this thing and we need to understand what's going on and watch all the things. So really, it's also about knowing your good customers. It's not just about catching fraudsters. Good customers need to be looked after. They need the better experience. This is security and CX together. But we need to swiftly reject the fraudsters and we need to shift left. This is, there was a conversation before about is this a fraud thing or a security thing or a digital thing? It is all of the above. But I think digital have a very strong role to play. Extremely strong role to play in this because we've now got the tools and technologies to bring these insights up front, real time. We know what's going on. We can make proper decisions. So I really think it's a case of, do we need to know this? Like, is it what we don't know, what we don't know? I actually think that we need to move this to a position where we should know what we absolutely need to know.